Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. My name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 93. With our book today, an exploration of the ironies, the twists, and the consequences and repercussions of choosing to believe deeply and completely in scientific materialism. A book that answers the question, how would the population of a city or a country, bereft of the language of transcendence, deal with John Milton's Satan if he actually showed up in reality? This is a book formerly on the Soviet Union's banned book list that pokes holes in the thin veneer of a Marxist communist worldview built almost entirely on lies, obfuscation, corruption, and a fundamental denial of reality itself. Today, we will be discussing the leadership lessons to be gleaned from what my guest co-host today called, before we got started here, a very serious book. And it is a very serious book, but it's written in an unserious sort of way. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail, I'm going to butcher this middle name, Afanasyevich, just butchered it, Bulgakov. I'm terrible with the Russian names. And I would like to introduce to us and to my listeners our guest co-host today, who is joining us on this podcast to talk about this book. As a matter of fact, she was the one that turned me on to this book and recommended that I read it after we've slogged through Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and even Anton Chekhov. We are joined today on the podcast by the consultant and corporate trainer, now living in Israel, Daria Rudnik. Hello, Daria. How are you doing today?
Hi, Sam. Thanks. Okay, I'm good.
Thanks for recommending the book. I appreciate it. I think we're going to have a great conversation here talking about this book. As usual, we're not going to read the whole book. We cannot possibly do that on this podcast. We are going to read selections from the book today. And so I'm going to pick up in chapter 1 of The Master and Margarita. We're going to really talk about, at least we're going to open with this idea of, what it means to talk to a stranger. So from chapter 1, from The Master and Margarita, never talk with strangers. And I quote, "Now Berlioz wanted to prove to the poet that the main thing was not how Jesus was, good or bad, but that the same Jesus was a person, as a person, simply never existed in the world, and that all the stories about him were mere fiction, the most ordinary mythology. It must be noted that the editor was a well-read man, and in his conversation very skillfully pointed to ancient historians, for instance, the famous Philo of Alexandria and the brilliantly educated Flavius Josephus, who never said a word about the existence of Jesus. Displaying a solid erudition, Mikhail Alexandrovich also informed the poet, among other things, that the passage in the 15th book of Tacitus's famous Annals, the 44th chapter where mention is made of the execution of Jesus, was nothing but a later spurious interpolation. The poet for whom everything the editor was telling him was new, listened attentively to Mikhail Alexandrovich, fixing his pert green eyes on him and merely hiccuped from time to time, cursing the apricot soda under his breath. There's not a single Eastern religion, Berlioz was saying, in which, as a rule, an immaculate virgin did not give birth to a god. And in just the same way, without inventing anything new, the Christians created their Jesus, who in fact never lived. It's on this that the main emphasis should be placed. Berlioz's high tenor rang out on the deserted walk, and as Mikhail Alexandrovich went deeper into the maze which only a highly educated man can go into without risking a broken neck, the poet learned more and more interesting and useful things about the Egyptian Osiris, a benevolent god and the son of heaven and earth, and about the Phoenician god Tammuz, and about Marduk, and even about the lesser-known terrible god Huitzilopochtli, once greatly venerated by the Aztecs in Mexico. And just at that moment, when Mikhail Alexandrovich was telling the poet how the Aztecs used to fashion figurines of Huitzilopochtli out of dough, the first man appeared in the walk. Afterwards, when frankly speaking it was already too late, the various institutions presented reports describing this man. A comparison of them cannot but cause amazement. Thus, the first of them said that the man was short, had gold teeth, and limped on his right leg. The second, that the man was enormously tall, had platinum crowns, and limped on his left leg. The third laconically averred that the man had no distinguishing marks. It must be acknowledged that none of these reports is of any value. First of all, the man described did not limp on any leg and was neither short nor enormous, but simply tall. As for his teeth, he had platinum crowns on the left side and gold on the right. He was wearing an expensive gray suit and imported shoes of a matching color. His gray beret was cocked rakishly over one ear. Under his arm, he carried a stick with a black knob shaped like a poodle's head. He looked to be a little over 40. Mouth somehow twisted, clean-shaven, dark-haired, right eye black, left, for some reason, green. Dark eyebrows, one higher than the other. In short, a foreigner. Having passed by the bench on which the editor and the poet were sitting, the foreigner gave them a sidelong look, stopped, and suddenly sat down on the next bench, 2 steps away from the friends. A German, thought Berlioz. An Englishman, thought Holmes. My, he must be hot in those gloves. The foreigner gazed around at the tall buildings that rectangularly framed the pond, making it obvious that he was seeing the place for the first time and that it interested him. He rested his glance on the upper floors where the glass dazzlingly reflected the broken-up sun, which was forever departing from Mikhail Alexandrovich, then shifted it lower down to where the windows were beginning to darken before evening, smiling condescendingly at something, narrowed his eyes, put his hands on the knob and his chin on his hands. For instance, Ivan, Berlioz was saying, you portrayed the birth of Jesus, the Son of God, very well and satirically, but the gist of it is that a whole series of sons of God were born before Jesus, like, say, the Phoenician Adonis, Phrygian Attis, the Persian Mithras. And to put it briefly, not one of them was born or ever existed, Jesus included, and what's necessary is that instead of portraying his birth or suppose the coming of the Magi, you portray the absurd rumors of their coming. Otherwise, it follows from your story that he was really born. Here, Holmes made an attempt to stop his painful hiccuping by holding his breath, which caused him to hiccup more painfully and loudly at the same moment. Berlioz interrupted his speech because the foreigner suddenly got up and walked towards the writers. They looked at him in surprise. Excuse me, please, the approaching man began speaking with a foreign accent, but without distorting the words. If, not being your acquaintance, I allow myself, but the subject of your learning conversation is so interesting that Mikhail, not going to try that middle name, just not. Bulgakov, Mikhail Bulgakov, born May 15th, 1891, died March 10th, 1940, was a Russian and later Soviet writer, medical doctor, and playwright. Was highly active in the first half of the 20th century. He wrote sensitively about the horrors of the Russian Civil War and about the fate of Russian intellectuals and officers of the Tsarist army caught up in the White Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution, and the subsequent Civil War. Some of his works, Flight, all of his works that were written between the years 1922 and 1926, and many others, were banned by the Soviet government, and personally by Joseph Stalin, after it was decided by them, and by by Stalin, that they, quote unquote, glorified emigration and white generals. Bulgakov was, and in all my research about him and reading about him, near as I could tell, he was a sensitive man that was born into insensitive times. He was a person who felt emotionally deeply about what was happening in his country, but did not have a political bone in his body. And this tension between not having that political bone in his body and the political things that were happening in his time came out in artistic, or manifested itself in artistic ways. He wrote plays, he wrote ballets, he wrote novels, and The Master and the Margarita was probably his most transcendent novel, but it's also his most satirical. And, well, this is some of the tension that we're going to talk about today on the podcast. How does an artist, how does a writer, how does a creator, how does a leader, how do you deal with the tension in a society where you may not care about politics, but politics cares very much about you? And how do you deal with a lack of language, which is something we're very consumed with on this podcast? We talked about it before. How do you deal with a lack of language around the transcendent when chaos, despair, and even destruction show up? How do you put it in a box if you don't have words to describe it? I personally am obsessed with this idea because I do believe that fundamentally in America, in this part of the 21st century, and Daria from Israel may disagree with me from where she's sitting, or she may agree. I don't know. But I think in America, we're done with the postmodern experiment. We're done with postmodern nihilism. And we're grasping around searching for some other language that can describe the world. We've abandoned religious language, which is the only language fundamentally that can describe many of the transcendent things that happen in the world. And thus we have no defense when Satan does indeed show up. And Satan always does. With that, I'd like to welcome Daria to the podcast, and I'd like to find out from her very first question: why should leaders read The Master and Margarita? And how did you come to this book? Talk to us about a little bit about your background, your journey to this book, and what Mikhail Bulgakov has done and has meant for you in your life.
Great question. Well, my full name is Daria Leonidovna Rudnik.
You're not going to say it. I'm not going to try. Not going to try. Not going to try.
Originally born in Russia, and like having to read Mikhail Afanasyevich Bulgakov at school. It's like part of the program. And I read it since then a couple more times, and recently in English for the first time.
I'm going to ask you, by the way, today about what the differences are in translation, because I think we miss things from the original Russian that matter in English, but maybe I'm wrong. Go ahead.
It was good. It really is good. Like this translation, this copy is good because I feel this, like the spirit, the same. It's the same feeling I have while reading it in English.
Okay.
And at some point, it's even like some things are even more obvious, like the name of the behemoth, which is in Russian, it's the same, but it's kind of the same meaning as hippopotamus. And kind of, it didn't occur to me that it's actually not that animal. It's behemoth. And I go, oh.
Well, talk a little bit about reading this in Russia. Like, what is it like reading it? I know what it's like reading it in America in the 21st century, in 2024, with everything that goes on in America, right? That's the background I come to it with, but you clearly come to it with a different sort of background. So what is it like reading Bulgakov in Russia? What is that like?
I'm really curious how kids read it in school now, because of the changing narrative about Stalin and everything that's happening. But when we read it, it was a satire on the Stalin regime and the way people lived there, as well as kind of the demonstration of the Soviet life that we still lived at that time, and we could recognize some of the things that were happening, and it's funny to see it and recognize it. And now we don't have those Soviet attributes that they changed, but the narrative about Stalin also changed, and like they're getting back the monuments of Stalin back, the signs of them back. So it's kind of getting back them as a heroic leader or something like that. So I don't know how they do it now, but then it was kind of like a wind of something that is, the world can be different, that you can see things that are closed, and you can kind of have a look. Oh, okay.
So it was like a little it was like a I compare it to looking into a keyhole, right? Or looking through a keyhole and seeing into a different room. How old are you when you first encountered this book?
15, probably.
Oh wow, okay. So any typical 15-year-old that I've ever met, and I've raised a few in my own house, and currently getting ready to raise another one, just a mass of hormones and ideas and stuff and nonsense, right? To be gentle about it. And that's again in an American context, right? In a Russian context, I guess same kind of sort of mix. How did your 15-year-old self look at that versus how you look at it now? And the reason that I ask that is because I read a book. There's a book that I'm a big fan of, The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. We covered the book on the podcast last year, I think episode number 83. And when I read that book when I was 15 or 12 or 10 or 8 or whatever, that book hit me totally differently in my mid 40s now. So what was the difference between reading it as a 15-year-old and then re-encountering it now?
I don't remember how it was in 15.
Okay.
But I remember there was something in this book that made me reread it when I was about 23 or something.
Okay.
Early 20s. And then I get it's kind of this, I can't even tell. It's like it's the feeling of, I may be right, like opening the door, and it opens more and more, and you kind of feel, you see better and how true it is what they're writing there. And some things I don't understand even now, and I probably want to reread it to understand some of the things. Why are they saying that? Like, what is the meaning of that? It kind of feels natural and right, but I don't know why is it so true. So yeah, I guess it's the question of why there's so many truths, but I don't understand some of them, and I keep searching in this book for the answers.
The book almost reveals more truths the more you get into it. Okay. What can leaders gain from this? If you're in a leadership position, why should I read this book?
I mean, I think you should read it as a human being, and most leaders are human beings, not all of them. But it's kind of the leadership in reverse.
Okay.
So what we see is like we have Stalin, who's the leader. We don't see him, but we know he's there. But what truly happens is the devil as the leader comes there to reveal the truth, to show what's happening, to show the reality. And he's leading the narrative, and he's leading the story in like revealing more and more absurd situations. And then the other reverse thing is when we have Margarita, who's actually a follower. She's following the master, but she's leading. She's saving him. She's sacrificing. So I guess it's about, it's not that we have like, who are the leaders, those heroes who save the world and people are following them and doing what they're told, but it can be different. leadership in various ways.
Mm-hmm. So you do coaching and consulting, right?
Yeah.
And so in your coaching and consulting work, talk a little bit about that. How do you see those dynamics play out in your coaching and consulting work with clients?
Well, as I mentioned, there is the idea of a great leader, and it's sometimes it's really good because people think I am as a leader, I am responsible for my team and my people, which means I need to save them,
Mm-hmm.
which means that those leaders don't give space for those people to save themselves. So what I think this book can help is just see the bigger picture of like various types of like being saved and saving, and it's not always the leader who saves everyone else. It's some of them the follow is saving. Sometimes it's even some outsider comes and helps. So kind of not having all the weight of this responsibility, but sharing the responsibility, sharing the vision, sharing the resources with the team, and doing that together.
It's interesting that you mentioned sharing vision and sharing resources, because the chapter, and I don't think we're going to read anything from it today. Yeah, we are. We're going to read a very small piece of it. Chapter 2, when you talk about the devil, when the stranger, the foreigner, describes the interaction between Jesus and Pontius Pilate, which of course is from his perspective. The way in which that is constructed, Jesus is not a savior. Jesus is not presented as a transcendent being, both God and man, which of course comes from the Christian conception of Jesus. He's portrayed in a different kind of way, and the emphasis is placed on Pontius Pilate in that particular chapter. And we'll read a couple of excerpts from that as well on the podcast today. Many leaders have what I call a Superman complex. But the other side of the Superman complex is the Jesus piece of it, which is the ability or the desire sometimes to be sacrificed on a pyre for the greater good. How does Bulgakov deal with that idea? How does he deal with that whole idea of like being that Superman, I guess? How does he kind of address that? Because you mentioned Stalin, and Stalin sort of floats around in the background of all of this. But there's other dynamics that are also happening. Can you talk a little bit about those in this book?
I mean, like you said, like Jesus is described like as a totally different, and even says like everything that's written after me is a lie.
Right. Right. You talk about Matthew Levi just all of a sudden just following him for no reason. And he was like, he's portrayed as being confused as to why Matthew Levi was following him, which I thought was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. But he actually, like, he comes in the end and he happened to rule this world anyway, without. And the sacrifice that he made, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was just the way he lives. And that led him to this death, which is part of his life, so to say. And then he comes to the end because he's actually as a light ruling and truth ruling this world. And the world is built the right way. Everything, like there's a saying, like I wanted to save it, that everything will turn out right. The world is built on that.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah. I mean, you don't need to be a Superman. The world is just built right.
Well, and that's good. It's good that you said that you don't need to be Superman, because that sort of segues us into this next piece, which is, which is interesting to me because the devil's pulling a trick here, right? Even in the communist Soviet Union, the devil's pulling a trick. And I'm fascinated by the nature of this trick, and we kind of pick it up here in The Master and Margarita, in chapter 12, when the devil, who now has acquired a name, Woland, Mr. Woland, now is going to put on a show. And so back to the book, back to The Master and Margarita. We're going to read from chapter 12, Black Magic and Its Exposure. I'm going to read some pieces from that. After uttering all this claptrap, Bengalski pressed his palms together and waved them in greeting through the slit of the curtain, which caused it to part with a soft rustle. The entrance of the magician with his long assistant and the cat, who came on stage on his hind legs, pleased the audience greatly. By the way, pause. The devil didn't come alone, so the devil's got an assistant who helps him negotiate an apartment, which I don't think we're going to cover that today, but that was really interesting to me. And then also has a cat that walks on hind legs and drinks vodka. Just so you know. All right. There's a lot of interesting things going on in this book. All right. So back to the book. An armchair for me, Woland ordered in a low voice. And that same second, an armchair appeared on stage. No one knew how or where, in which the magician sat down. Tell me, my gentle faggot, Woland inquired of the checkered clown, who evidently had another appellation other than Koroviev. What do you think the Moscow populace has changed significantly, hasn't it? The magician looked out at the hushed audience, struck by the appearance of the armchair out of nowhere. That it has, monsieur, faggot Koroviev replied in a low voice. You're right. The city folk have changed greatly. Externally, that is, as has the city itself, incidentally. Not to mention their clothing. These, what you call them, trams, automobiles have appeared. Buses, faggot prompted deferentially. The audience listened attentively to this conversation, thinking it was a prelude to the magic tricks. The wings were packed with performers and stagehands, and among their faces could be seen the tense, pale face of Rimsky. The physiognomy of Bengalski, who had retreated to the side of the stage, began to show some perplexity. He raised one eyebrow slightly and, taking advantage of a pause, spoke. The foreign artiste is expressing his admiration for Moscow and its technological development, as well as for the Muscovites. Here, Bengalski smiled twice, first to the stalls, then to the gallery. Woland, faggot, and the cat turned their heads in the direction of the master of ceremonies. Did I express admiration? The magician asked the checkered faggot. By no means, monsieur. You never expressed any admiration, came the reply. Then what is the man saying? He quite simply lied, the checkered assistant declared sonorously for the whole theater to hear, and turned to Bengalski. He added, Congrats, citizen, you done lied. Tittering spattered from the gallery, but Bengalski gave a start and goggled his eyes. Of course, I'm not so much interested in buses, telephones, and other apparatuses, the checkered one prompted. Quite right, thank you, the magician spoke slowly in a heavy bass, as in a question of much greater importance. Have the city folks changed inwardly? Yes, that is the most important question, sir. There was shrugging and an exchanging of glances in the wings. Bengalski stood all red and Rimsky was pale. But here, as if sensing the nascent alarm, the magician said, However, we're talking away, my dear faggot, and the audience is beginning to get bored. Show us some simple little things to start off with. The audience stirred. Faggot and the cat walked along the footlights to opposite sides of the stage. Faggot snapped his fingers and with a rollicking 3-4, snatched a deck of cards from the air, shuffled it, and sent it in a long ribbon to the cat. The cat intercepted it and sent it back. The satiny snake whiffled. Faggot opened his mouth like a nestling and swallowed it all, card by card. After which the cat bowed, scraping his right hind paw, winning himself unbelievable applause. Class, real class, rapturous shouts came from the wings. And Faggot jabbed his fingers at the stalls and announced, You'll find that same deck, esteemed citizens, on Citizen Parchevsky in the 7th row, just between a 3-ruble bill and a summons to court in connection with the payment of alimony to Citizeness Zelkova. There was some stirring in the stalls. People began to get up, and finally some citizen, whose name indeed was Parchevsky, all crimson with amazement, extracted the deck from his wallet and began sticking it up in the air, not knowing what to do with it. You may keep it as a souvenir, cried Faggot. Not For nothing did you say at dinner yesterday that if it weren't for poker, your life in Moscow would be utterly unbearable. An old trick, came from the galley. That one of the stalls is from the same company. You think so? Shouted Faggot, squinting at the gallery. In that case, you're also one of us, because the deck is now in your pocket. There was movement in the balcony, and a joyful voice said, He's right, he's got it here, wait, it's 10 ruble bills. Those sitting in the stalls turned their heads. In the gallery, a bewildered citizen found in his pocket a bank-wrapped packet with 1,000 rubles written on it. His neighbors hovered over him, and he, in amazement, picked at the wrapper with his fingernail, trying to find out if the bills were real or some sort of magic ones. By God, they're real. 10 ruble bills. Joyful cries came from the gallery. I want to play with the same kind of deck, a fat man in the middle of the stalls requested merrily. Vez, please, Faggot responded. But why just you? Everyone will warmly participate. And he commanded, look up, please. 1, there was a pistol in his hand. He shouted, 2, the pistol was pointed up. He shouted, 3, there was a flash, a bang, and all at once from under the cupola, bobbing between the trapezes, white strips of paper began falling into the theater. They twirled, got blown aside, were drawn towards the gallery, bounced into the orchestra, and onto the stage. In a few seconds, the rain of money, ever thickening, reached the seats, and the spectators began snatching at it. Hundreds of arms were raised. The spectators held the bills up to the lighted stage and saw the most true and honest-to-God watermarks. The smell also left no doubts. It was the incomparably delightful smell of freshly printed money. The whole theater was seized first with merriment, then with amazement. The word money, money hummed everywhere. There were gasps of ah, and merry laughter. 1 or 2 were already crawling in the aisle, feeling under the chairs. Many stood on seats, trying to catch the flighty, capricious notes. Perplexity was gradually coming to the faces of the policemen, and performers unceremoniously began sticking their heads out from in the wings. In a dress circle, a voice was heard. What are you grabbing at? It's mine. It flew to me. Another voice. Don't shove me or you get shoved back. And suddenly there came a sound of a whack. At once, a policeman's helmet appeared in the dress circle, and someone from the dress circle was led away. The general agitation was increasing, and no one knows where it all would have ended if Faggot had not stopped the rain of money by suddenly blowing into the air. One of the major things that struck me in reading The Master and the Margarita was the use by Bulgakov of magical realism, in line with Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being, a line with Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and of course, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. We read all of those books on this podcast, and there's lessons to be learned from the use of the literary technique magical realism, because you can say things and just kind of chalk it up to magic, or chalk it up not even to realism, chalk it up to magic, and kind of get away with stuff on the edges. And this is what Bulgakov is doing with this very famous piece in The Master and Margarita. This chapter, Black Magic and Exposure, chapter 12, follows on several chapters that reveal Woland, or Satan, or the devil. I prefer to think of him as John Milton's Satan. Really, I do. That's what comes to mind. Floating through the city of Moscow, having interactions with not Stalin, but having interactions with the bureaucracy that Stalin built, and sort of worming his way through that bureaucracy as a Luciferian intellect is often wont to do. But you can't tell the truth about that, right? Because Bulgakov is writing in a society in the 1930s and 1940s where there are purges, where there are concentration camps. I'm sorry, pardon me, not concentration camps, gulags. Let's use the correct term here, where people are being put away at the writing of script, as if it is a bodily function by Stalin. Literally, you got that guy up on the wrong side of the bed. You were going to the gulag. You were going to get a tenor as the writer of the Gulag Archipelago Noted. And the only way to tell the truth about this is to exaggerate, right? It's to kind of go over the top in order to avoid the censors, in order to avoid, and it's no accident, by the way, that Bulgakov mentions this in The Master Margarita in that scene at the theater, in order to avoid the censors and the policemen who are always watching. An atheistic society, or at least a society built on communist atheism, may not believe in Satan, but Satan believes in you. This is what I always tell my atheist friends. It doesn't really matter if you don't believe. It's going to find you. It's sort of a law of reality. So, Daria, what should we take about, and you talked about reading this in the context of a human being, right? And of course, under the context of the changing narrative around Stalin. You said you don't know how it's being read now, but during the time when you were reading it, it was being read in a certain way. Let's talk a little bit. Let's explore. Let's pull apart the power of satire, exaggeration, myth, storytelling, because all of this is employed by Bulgakov in The Master and Margarita. So let's start with that. How does he use exaggeration? How does he use satire? And how does that strike you in his writing?
To me, it feels like it was something really, really hurtful, like painful, because Bulgakov, like, is really very sensitive about what's happening. Mm-hmm. And he had some relationship with Stalin, and he knew, like, he couldn't ever publish this book, mm-hmm. but he still couldn't hold it and couldn't keep it. And when there is something that you cannot say, you use a metaphor, exaggeration, etc., to express the feeling that you have. And and in organizations, we all have some myths, mm-hmm. something that people tell each other about, some like very old employees that been in the company for many years. Why? Or something that CEO likes or hates. Mm-hmm. Some stories always going on, and they create this feeling and the culture of the organization. So when leaders want to, I can't say build culture, or at least somehow understand what's going on, like, it's very good to see, like, what are the myths? What are the company myths? What are the stories people telling to each other? What stories are you telling during this onboarding meeting? What stories do you tell to each other? And maybe build some new myths, maybe tell some new stories, and kind of shaping the culture from that.
Well, it's interesting. So you mentioned that you read it in one way at 15 and at 23, and then again. And then you also mentioned that there's a changing of the myths around Stalin currently occurring in Russia. I don't know that Americans are fully aware of that. I don't know that the average American who, again, doesn't pay attention to politics is really kind of focused just on their house and their life does, and going to their job and getting in their car, driving back home. Like, they're not, something comes out of the sky about Russia being in the Ukraine, and they're like, where's that? I don't know. Like, I really don't know where that is. And you know, I say this very often to folks, you know, who I work with and who are, you know, come out of an international context. The thing you got to understand is America's so big, we've never had to pay attention to anything else because we got enough problems here that consume our time and our efforts. And you even saw this. I mean, my God, like, we've had presidents who don't care about international affairs. Barack Obama was notorious for saying, I'm really just going to outsource all that to, like, other people because I really just care about what's happening here. Okay. Bill Clinton also said the same thing. Oh, okay. But eventually, just like the devil showing up in an atheist country, international events always show up to you. And so you have to understand how those myths are changing in other countries, even if you don't fully understand it all the way down to the bone. You mentioned organizations. Well, a nation state like Russia, like America, like China, Israel is just an organization. It's like a company, just at scale, a company with more people, right? You also said that Bulgakov, knew Stalin and was hurt by him. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because again, the myth around Stalin in the United States is this guy was a monster from his birth. Now we know that that's not true because no one is a monster from their birth. And I've read a significant amount about Stalin and Lenin and their relationship and where Stalin came from, and sort of able to put together a psychological profile of that guy. But for the average leader who listens to this, either nationally or internationally, who doesn't really understand why that would be, why was Bulgakov hurt by Stalin? And then how would that translate into his myth making around that? Like, why was he hurt? Because most people probably wouldn't understand that.
I'm in the situation where I'm about to break my neck going deeply into the history.
Go right on ahead. That's why we're here. Go break away, knock yourself out.
The thing is, like, Bulgakov wrote a lot about the immigrants because those people were highly educated. Because they were highly educated people who wanted to to get back to the Russia that was before. Okay. I'm not going to tell that it was better and then was it was very, very hard time. Lots of people believe they're doing the good thing on both sides. From both sides, there was a lot of cruelty. It's a war. It was a war. It was really, really bad. And
this is during the Bolshevik Revolution and the cities and
the revolution and then the civil war. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. And then there was Stalin, and who actually there was a period of repressions when, like you said, Gulag people sent for very minor things. And actually my my grandmother's father was sent, but then luckily they were released at some point. But that happened, and that touched almost every person in the country. So whenever you knew someone, you knew someone who was hurt by either war or repressions or revolution. But there were things that you cannot say because they were building a new culture, they were building a new religion, I would say. They were building a new society and things that people were not allowed to say. And this conflict is very hard. It's very hard to keep.
So you said that exaggeration and myth were used to express those complicated feelings, right? As a literary tool to express those complicated feelings. But then it tips over, and you see this in the clip in the piece that we just read, it tips over into this magical piece, right? Rubles falling from the sky, right? Or a gentleman who's trying to get, quote unquote, the right people into an apartment building who winds up failing that negotiation and then gets busted for having American currency or foreign currency. He didn't describe specifically which country the currency came from, but foreign currency in his in the air shaft, right? And then he's off. He's going to the gulag. I literally, that's what I thought when I read that. I was like, well, that guy's done. That guy's not coming back. Or you have the poet Homeless, who, and we're not going to read any of that because it's extremely complicated, but basically the poet sees his editor get decapitated and goes crazy, which is an appropriate response, by the way, to that. But then the insanity opens the door, this is the magical part, to actually seeing truth. the magical parts of the Master and the Margarita don't get talked about nearly enough. Let me ask you a question. When you were a kid in Russia, as an adult in your history, is there a lot of magic in Russia? Is there a lot of talking about, or how does that get talked about? How does that get framed? Because I know in a Latin American context, it gets framed in a certain way. We're very familiar with that context in America because it just, we border Mexico. Like that's just Latin America it just is, right? And so we're very familiar with how that's framed. Chinua Achebe in Things Fall Apart wrote about magic happening in an African tribal context, a Nigerian African tribal context. The Unbearable Lightness of Being, Milan Kundera wrote about it happening in a Czech context. He tied it closer to realism than to magic, but there were some magical elements in that book. How do the magical elements play out in just sort of in a Russian context? How does that happen?
I mean, we love magic.
Okay.
And again, I think
the people were clapping. I mean, they loved it when the rubles were falling from the sky and then they turned into slips of paper. But yeah, go ahead.
When I was reading it as a kid, probably that was one of the things that actually attracts me, because it's kind of a fairy tale. There's some magic going on. There's some Satan, and again, there's things happening, and the vampires, and kind of this stuff. So it's interesting, and we have Strugatsky is also there's a lot about magical things happening.
Mm-hmm.
When they write about the Institute of Research of Magic,
yep,
kind of researching magic institute, and so it's pretty. I think probably it was one of the ways of describing the reality through a fairy tale and magic.
Right. Well, and when you read Russian novels in general, you do get a sense of, I think the word I'm looking for is cynicism underneath about it. So you'll get a fairy tale in Peter Pan, right? Or something like that, right? That's written from a very Western centric perspective. And it seems very innocent and it's not weighty, right? But then you get a fairy tale written from a Russian context, and there's tragedy, there's cynicism, there's all these other dynamics that are going on. And then, and obviously in a fairy tale, it's a fantasy. So I think about the most famous fairy tale that I think most Americans know from Russia is Tchaikovsky's the Nutcracker Suite, right? Like that's the most famous one that sort of attained worldwide, sort of fame. But it has all of the elements of a traditional Russian perspective on the world of that sort of tragedy, the sort of cynicism, a touch of regret, there's some anger in there. It's weighted down with some of these other things, and it is still a fairy tale. I mean, for God's sake, she got a mouse that is shooting a gun, right? And then that's supposed to be an allegory for I believe the Crimean War, if I remember correctly. That's supposed to be an allegorical sort of stand-in for the Crimean War, but that's, you wouldn't see something like that in a more Western centric sort of fairy tale, or at least we would try to split up all of those mythological themes into different genres, right? Because you don't want to scare the kids too much. In the Master and Margarita, Stalin lurks underneath the bureaucracy. And so I want to ask you a little bit about this. The devil interacts with the bureaucracy, but he doesn't interact with Stalin. How does that work? Like, how does Stalin get to be the thing that hid behind the book? And so the devil never really sort of goes all the way to dealing with the core from our now perspective in 2024, the core problem. It doesn't happen. But he deals with the bureaucracy of, the bureaucracy of getting a house, and or not a house, an apartment, not even a house, an apartment. Or we're going to talk about Berlioz's place he used to hang out with all the other poets and how they had great food there, right? We might touch a little bit on that. Why did Bulkagov make that decision? Because I know that Stalin reached out to him personally. This was some of the things that I read on him. Stalin reached out to him personally and kind of gave him a job. After he wrote a letter to him basically saying, I can't get a job here, and you either got to lock me up or let me go, like one of the two things. And Stalin was such a big fan, he called him, which I can imagine the sweat that must have been running down that guy's face when Stalin calls you on the phone. He must have like turned inside out. Because that could go one of two ways, right? And both of those ways are bad. And so the fact that it turned into an upside for him and that he was allowed to sort of work unmolested was probably the best deal that he was ever going to get from Stalin. So I guess the question is, why did the devil go bother Stalin? I guess that's the question. And I guess it's a question that only I would ask, but it is a question that occurs to me. Like, why not just have the devil go bother him? He's the problem. Just go out and bother him. Why did he do that?
Well, I guess like the main reason is because devil is not a savior.
Right.
And like he came there for his own reasons and just revealed all the thing. But the other thing is, all of this bureaucracy were done by people. Those people that like Voland was interacting with.
Mm-hmm.
And no one forced them to sell like fish of the second freshness. No one forced them to write those, like saying, screaming, I'm busy, like I want to go to hell. Like things like that. Everything that's happening there. People just said, okay, I'll deal with this little thing. And again, I'll deal with this little thing again. And another little thing. And they kind of selling their souls step by step, accepting this bureaucracy and the way this world works. So that's why it's not so much of Stalin, it's the people who did that.
I want to revisit that idea. I love how you framed that, selling their soul step by step. Because this is something else that concerns me deeply, is that it's not in general, the idea is that you commit a big crime or a big sin or a big mistake, right? But in general, that's not how it happens, actually. And I think many people everywhere, this is a human condition thing, they are unable to track the steps that take them down into hell. And then once they're down there, they're unable to find the steps to step out. And that's part of what you see in The Master and Margarita. And I think you're onto something there. And I think that leaders have to have, and we'll talk a little bit about this a little bit later, but the leaders have to have the moral clarity to say that's a step to hell. Don't do that. Now, if people go and do it, that's on them, but you rang the bell. You said the warning. And I think that escalation in our society today, our societies today that happen, no matter what country you're in, no matter what the internal things may be happening or external things, there's always a choice. There's always a choice to escalate. There's always a choice to either further step into degradation or to step out. And I don't think people give themselves enough credit for the agency to choose to not do that. Back to the book. Back to The Master and Margarita. So we are reading a version of this. I always say this at least once on the podcast. We are reading a version of this. I'm not going to tell you which version, but I want you to go out and pick it up. There are several really good versions. Probably the best one is going to be a version in Russian, if you can get it. And if you can read it, good on you. I unfortunately cannot read Russian. The Cyrillic alphabet looks to me like a bunch of scribble, and that's because of the problem with me, not with the alphabet.
Look at Hebrew.
And right, exactly. There you go. That's right. So I have enough trouble in English. I try to stick to the things that I know. But as we pointed out, the translation that I have, which again I'm not going to tell you which one it is for copyright purposes, but the translation that I have is really good. And you can go search for it on Amazon or Thrift Books or Barnes and Noble. I would recommend going out and getting it. And by the way, it is a hefty book. It is around 400 pages, but it moves fairly quickly because Bulgakov is not writing. He's not Dostoevsky, right? He's not doing that thing. He's also not Tolstoy. He's not making it romantic, right? He can move a little bit quicker. And so unlike many Russian novels that you may have been exposed to as a listener or that we've read on this podcast, it tips a little bit more towards maybe something like Solzhenitsyn or Chekhov versus Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, right? And actually, it's probably more in line with Chekhov than anything else in the speed with which you can kind of move through this book. So back to the book. So we're going to pick this up. We're actually going to go backwards a little bit. So we were on chapter 12. We're actually going to go back to chapter 2. And we're going to meet a gentleman that some of you may know from the Bible. The guy, Bulgakov, I think, kind of got a bad rap. And maybe this is his stand-in for Stalin. We're going to meet a gentleman named Pontius Pilate. And I quote, So, Pilate said, smiling, now I have no doubts that the idle loafers of Yerushalayim followed at your heels. I don't know who hung such a tongue on you, but he hung it well. Incidentally, tell me, is it true that you entered Yerushalayim by the Susa gate, riding on an ass, accompanied by a crowd of riffraff who shouted greetings to you as some kind of prophet? Here the procurator pointed to the parchment scroll. The prisoner glanced at the procurator in perplexity. I don't even have an ass, Hegemon, he said. I did enter Jerusalem by the Susa gate, but on foot, accompanied only by Matthew Levi, and no one shouted anything to me because no one in Jerusalem knew me then. Do you happen to know, Pilate continued without taking his eyes off the prisoner, such men as a certain Decimus, another named Gestas, and a third named Bar Rabbin? I do not know these good people, the prisoner replied. Truly? Truly. And now tell me, why is it that you use the words good people all the time? Do you call everyone that, or what? Everyone, the prisoner replied. There are no evil people in the world. The first I hear of it, Pilate said, grinning, but perhaps I know too little of life. You needn't record anymore, he addressed the secretary, who had not recorded anything anyway, and went on talking with the prisoner. You read that in some Greek book? No, I figured it out for myself. And you preach it? Yes. But take, for instance, the centurion Mark, the one known as Rat Slayer. Is he good? Yes, replied the prisoner. True, he's an unhappy man. Since the good people disfigured him, he has become cruel and hard. I'd be curious to know who maimed him. I can willingly tell you that, Pilate responded, for I was witness to it. The good people fell on him like dogs on a bear. There were Germani fastened on his neck, his arms, his legs. The infantry maniple was encircled, and if one flank hadn't been cut by a cavalry term, of which I was the commander, you, philosopher, would not have had the chance to speak with the Rat Slayer. That was at the Battle of Idistavicio in the Valley of the Virgins. If I could speak with him, the prisoner suddenly said musingly, I'm sure he changed sharply. I don't suppose, Pilate responded, that you'd bring much joy to the legate of the Legion if you decided to talk with any of his officers or soldiers. Anyhow, it's also not going to happen, fortunately for everyone, and I will be the first to see to it. At that moment, a swallow swiftly flitted into the colonnade, described a circle under the golden ceiling, swooping down, almost brushed the face of a bronze statue in a niche with its pointed wing, and disappeared behind the capital of a column. It may be that it thought of nesting there. And then we're going to move forward a little bit. Listen, Hanorzi, the procurator spoke, looking at Yeshua somehow strangely. The procurator's face was menacing, but his eyes were alarmed. Did you ever say anything about the great Caesar? Answer. Did you? Yes or no? Pilate drew the word no out somewhat longer than is done in court, and his glance sent Yeshua some thought, as if he wished to instill in the prisoner. To speak the truth is easy and pleasant, the prisoner observed. I have no need to know, Pilate responded in a stifled, angry voice, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant for you to speak the truth. You will have to speak it anyway. But as you speak, weigh every word unless you want not only an inevitable but also painful death. No one knew what had happened with the procurator of Judea, but he allowed himself to raise his hand as if to protect himself from a ray of sunlight, and from behind his hand, as from behind a shield, to send the prisoner some sort of prompting look. Answer then, he went on speaking. Do you know a certain Judas from Kiriath? And what precisely did you say to him about Caesar, if you said anything? It was like this, the prisoner began talking eagerly. The evening before last, near the temple, I made the acquaintance of a young man who called himself Judas from the town of Kiriath. He invited me to his place in the lower city and treated me to a good man, Pilate asked, and a devilish fire flashed in his eyes. A very good man and an inquisitive one, the prisoner confirmed. He showed the greatest interest in my thoughts and received me very cordially. Light the lamps. Pilate spoke through his teeth in the same tone as the prisoner, and his eyes glinted. Yes, Yeshua went on, slightly surprised that the procurator was so well informed, and asked me to give my view of state power. He was extremely interested in this question. And what did you say? Asked Pilate. Or are you going to reply that you've forgotten what you said? But there was already a hopelessness in Pilate's tone. Among other things, the prisoner recounted, I said that all power is violence over people, and that a time will come when there will be no power of the Caesars nor any other power. Man will pass into the kingdom of truth and justice, where generally there will be no need for any power at all. Go on. I didn't go on, said the prisoner. Here men ran in, bound me, and took me away to prison. The secretary, trying not to let it drop a single word, rapidly traced the words on his parchment. There never has been, is not, and never will be any power in this world greater or better for people than the power of the Emperor Tiberius. Pilate's cracked and sick voice swelled. For some reason, the procurator looked at the secretary and the convoy with hatred. And it is not for you, insane criminal, to reason about it. Here, Pilate shouted. Convoy, off the balcony. And he, turning to the secretary, he added, leave me alone with this criminal. This is a state matter. Convoy raised their spears and with a measured tramp of hobnailed caligae, walked off the balcony into the garden, and the secretary followed the convoy. For some time, the silence on the balcony was broken only by the water singing in the fountain. Pilate saw how the watery dish blew up over the spout, how its edges broke off, how it fell down in streams. The prisoner was first to speak. I see that some misfortune has come about because I talked with that young man from Kiriath. I have a foreboding, Hegemon, that he will come to grief, and I'm very sorry for him. I think, the procurator replied, grinning strangely, that there is now someone else in the world for whom you ought to feel sorrier than for Judas of Kiriath, and who is going to have it much worse than Judas. So then, Mark Ratslayer, a cold and convinced torturer, the people who, as I see, the procurator pointed to Yeshua's disfigured face, beat you for your preaching. The robbers Dismas and Gestus, who with their confreres killed 4 soldiers, and finally the dirty traitor Judas, all are good people? Yes, said the prisoner. And the kingdom of truth will come? It will, Hegemon, Yeshua answered with conviction. It will never come, Pilate suddenly cried out in such a terrible voice that Yeshua drew back. Thus, many years before in the Valley of the Virgins, Pilate had cried to his horsemen with the words, cut them down, the giant rat slayer is trapped. He raised his voice, cracked with commanding still more, and called out so that his words could be heard in the garden, criminal, criminal, criminal! And then, lowering his voice, he asked, Yeshua Ha-Norzi, do you believe in any gods? God is one, replied Yeshua. I believe in him. Chapter 2 of The Master and Margarita. covers Yeshua, or Jesus's, meeting with Pontius Pilate as told by Mr. Wolland to a mouth agape atheist editor and a poet who's about to go mad on a park bench in the middle of Moscow. Matter of fact, the story was told by Mr. Wolland, or the devil, so well that Homeless, the poet, believed he was there, witnessing it himself. We already talked a little bit about exaggeration and satire and truth. This, however, this section I picked to read because this is more about the tension between myth and the truth. So there's an idea in a movie that I'm a big fan of, and it may be a movie that that Daria may have seen, or you may not have seen. I don't know how familiar you are with cinema, but there's a movie from back in the 60s called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. It's a Western starring John Wayne, and it was directed by a guy named John Ford, written by James Warner Bella and Willis Goldbeck. And there's a line in it that Jimmy Stewart doesn't say it, but basically the plot of the movie is that Jimmy Stewart was a young idealistic lawyer who went west and was going to tame the West with law. And John Wayne, not John Stewart, John Wayne was a gunslinger, and Lee Marvin was the villain. And Lee Marvin as the villain didn't care about the law. A law book wasn't going to be the thing that was going to stop him. Matter of fact, he spat on the law book. Matter of fact, he burned the law books. He thought the law books were nonsense. There was only one thing that was going to stop a guy like that, and that was a bullet. And eventually, Jimmy Stewart, who was the man of the law, had to come to the realization that the law wasn't the only thing that was always going to work if he wanted to get justice. And he brought himself finally, and this is a movie, again, it's well over 50 years old, so you can go get this. And it does relate to The Master and Margarita in several different ways, but Jimmy Stewart in the movie decides that he's going to shoot Lee Marvin. And he gets up the courage to go do it. And he does indeed fire the gun in the Old West, but it's not him that ends up shooting the villain. It's the guy who he dismissed, John Wayne, who winds up shooting the villain. But everybody thinks that it's Jimmy Stewart. That was the myth. Everybody thought that Jimmy Stewart was the hero. And matter of fact, he was able to take that, and he was able to become a congressman from the territory and a governor and all these other kinds of things. He was able to acquire political power from this myth. And you know what happened with the John Wayne character? Precisely nothing. He was forgotten. And a journalist many years later is interviewing Jimmy Stewart in the movie. And Jimmy Stewart tells him the truth when he's a very old man. And you know what the media guy says, the newspaper man, when he's pressed by his young, innocent, naive protege to print the truth? He says, and I quote, "When there's a myth and the truth, you print the myth." And that's where the movie stops. I don't know how the man who shot Liberty Valance would have played in Russia, but I think all y'all would have laughed at it, but I think you would have gotten it. Because just like in The Master and Margarita, the tension between the myth and the truth, and the printing of the myth to make the myth become truth, is the thing that Bulkagov is exploring here. Pontius Pilate asks Jesus, this is recorded in the Bible, I believe it's in the book of Luke, if I remember correctly, although it might be in Mark. Pilate asks Jesus, what is truth? Which is a truly excellent question that could only be asked by somebody who's so totally, completely blind as a bureaucrat to the very thing that's standing in front of him. And Pontius Pilate, by the way, portrayed correctly in The Master and the Margarita, was a bureaucrat. He served another power. He was, but he and he was so blind to the truth that he could not see it when it was standing right in front of him. Bulkagov plays with this because he knows that that's a truly excellent question. And I think that's his critique of Stalin. I think Stalin was Pontius Pilate, but he couldn't call him that, obviously. So he just built the entire myth around him. So here's a question for you, Daria. How can leaders have the moral character to say the truth and not print the myth? And by the way, this book was written during a time when the number one newspaper in Russia, or, well, not the number one, I'm sorry, the only newspaper in Russia was Pravda, a word that ironically means truth. And that thing wasn't worth, at least from what I hear, I never saw an actual version of Pravda, but from what I hear, that thing wasn't worth lining a birdcage with. How do leaders deal with this? How do you deal with this dynamic? Because this happens in organizations too. Memos get printed that are full of lies, and everybody knows what the truth is, but no one has the moral character to say it.
I have a quote.
Yeah, go ahead. I loaded you up there. I gave you a lot.
And it's kind of goes there, I think, twice, that cowardice is undoubtedly one of the most terrible vices. And it is the most terrible vice. So leaders need to find their courage and seek for the truth and tell the truth.
How do you do that if you're surrounded by people who would rather lie and get away with it?
I mean, in terms of organizational perspective, it's if you're on top, you actually creating those beef, you creating the stories, you telling the truth, you leading. If you are in the middle, I mean, and you cannot change anything, I mean, just leave. Like Master Margarita, they leave, and Homeless, he left this literature organization finally because you cannot change something that doesn't want to change, and you don't have to save them. Your job is to be truthful.
But Daria, you don't understand. I have kids. I have a wife. I have bills. I have a car payment. I have a mistress I haven't told my wife about. I have a boat. I've got all these expenses. I've got all these expenses, Daria. You don't understand.
Yeah, and second freshness comes after that.
Okay. Well, there's, courage has always been in short supply, though. Always. Genius is everywhere. Everybody's brilliant. But the number of people who are actually courageous, very tiny.
No, everybody's courageous.
You think so?
I mean, when you go for a date, it's so scary.
It's been a long time since I went for a date, so I don't know what that means. But okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, when you find a new job, when you start a new job, it's scary. When you learn a new skill, it's always scary. I mean, we all do things that are scary, and we still would do that because we feel it's important and we want to do that, and yeah.
Okay. I'm in 1920s, 1930s Russia. How can I be courageous in that environment?
I mean, you're not.
Why not?
I mean,
why am I not a coward there?
There were different ways of people being courageous there.
Okay. What are the different ways of being courageous?
Just living the life that is right for them. Talking. I mean, there's kitchen conversations. Kitchen is a sacred place. Was a sacred place. It still is. When people get together and talk, like really talk. They were self-publishing books.
Mm-hmm.
All those books that were banned, they were self-published, handed to different people. And it was like huge, like self-publishing is huge.
Mm-hmm.
People printing them out. So there are ways of doing that without hurting your family and your life. But again, we are not in Russia in 20s, 30s.
Mm-hmm.
We're in a much better world. Well, at least like Russia, Israel, US, and we are in a much better world. We can be courageous. We have the space for that.
Well, I think I don't know how much you know about this in the United States, but there are people who are some listeners to this podcast, and this podcast does exist in a particular cultural context as well. And the cultural context of the last 10 years in America has been a culture, particularly in politically progressive elite circles, where there's a lot of policing of the right thing to say. And if you don't say the right thing, if you break, you do lose your career. That's where this idea of cancel culture, that you may have heard of, comes from, right? And while it's not compared to anything that had occurred in Russia in the 20th century, there are people who are significantly concerned that it could lead, remember those tiny steps? That it could lead in tiny steps down into that hell. And by the way, there's some statistics to back some of this up. I mean, 30% of the people in America who are between the ages of 18 and 26 are kind of on the fence about free speech. That's ridiculous. By the way, I'm not part of that generation. I'm 2 generations older. I'm not on the fence about free speech. You need free speech. And I don't really, to your point, it doesn't really matter if it hurts your feelings. Like, I'm not really concerned about that. Because if it's true and it hurts your feelings, then that means your feelings are incorrect. And your feelings need to change, not the thing that is true. But that's very hard for people who are getting ready to inherit the West or inherit America, such as it is. That's very hard for them to wrap their arms around. And so there's a lot of policing of speech that has gone on in the last 10 years. And so you say that, and don't get me wrong, there are still people who are publishing, and there are people who are pushing back, and there's all these kinds of things that are happening. But the cultural sense you get in America anyway is that something fragile is being threatened, and that if you don't rush to defend it, then it'll go away. And I do think that's true to a degree. In an organization, let's make this very tiny. In an organization, if I'm in the middle of the organization and I can't change it, how do I make a plan to leave? How do I do that? Well, should I have a kitchen conversation with my spouse or partner? Like, should I start with that?
Again, maybe it's my cultural context, but
sure.
It was Chekhov and Bulgakov. They write about the small people, like very unimportant people who are making unimportant choices. So for me, it's not about making a big change, but it's about making the small choices that are right, that are doing that for the better. And in organizational context, I've seen many good people, leaders, who were acting as shields for their people and creating safe environment for their people, protecting them from senior toxic leaders. So that's one of the ways to do that.
I liked how you framed that of making small choices, right? Because I think sometimes we get caught up in the scale of a thing. You know, it's kind of like the comparison I make is when people decide if they're going to whether or not they're going to donate to a nonprofit organization, right? You know, and in general, the smaller, the more innocuous the donation the ask you can make of the other party, the more likely they are to give it to you, right? But if you do that enough with enough people, then all of a sudden you have this mass of cash, right? And the bigger the ask that you ask of folks, the more likely you are to hit resistance, internal psychological resistance to that ask. And I think the same as what happens with nonprofits, the same psychology operates in what you're talking about. Something occurs to me that I should ask you, and your experience as a coach and as a leadership consultant, and in the similar space that I'm in. And I want to see if you've seen some of the same things that I've seen. I think we both probably had different experiences, but we both have probably come to similar conclusions. So COVID changed people's perspective on all of this stuff, because it gave people, I think, the average person in the middle of the organization, it gave them permission to say no. It was the big, you talk about, we talked earlier about seeing through the keyhole. COVID was the keyhole through the door where they could see the other side. And in America, a lot of people quit their jobs. A lot of people packed up their families and moved around. I'm one of those people. Several other people I know personally, and just, not and impersonally, just look at statistics. People moved around, not only changed jobs and changed careers, but also are now putting pressure on organizations to change culture, because quite frankly, the toothpaste of working in an office is out of the tube. And I don't think the CEOs and the toxic leaders, to your point, the ones who want everything to go bad, I don't think they're losing the argument. They're in the process of losing the argument in the other direction. But did you see that with COVID? Like, what did you see with folks with COVID? In your opinion, did COVID give people permission to do that thing, to have that courage?
Like, from what I see, COVID gave people the feeling of another life.
Okay.
Like, I can live a better life when I'm not like fixed to the office. I'm not sitting there all week and without opportunity to do anything else. So they kind of gave this. On the other side, there was a big part of being isolated and lonely. But still, people don't want to sacrifice that. They don't want to, okay, I'd better be lonely and overloaded my family stuff rather than going every day to the office doing sometimes meaningless work.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see how, I kind of saw this trend, like you're saying, but then those were big layoffs. And again, people are holding for their jobs because there's not enough job for everyone. Good jobs. So we'll see how, but eventually, I think once they had this feeling of freedom,
Mm-hmm.
it really, really hard to get them back to where we were. And people changed, and organizations changed. Lots of organizations, even before COVID, they were had this idea of self-management, of working towards the vision, of sharing their power with employees. That was before COVID. COVID just showed to the majority, you can have, not the majority, okay, many other worlds, mostly in tech, show them how that they can live different lives. So it'll change.
Yeah, I think it poured accelerant over things that were already occurring, right? It poured gasoline on the fire, in essence. I also think that it poured gasoline on people's courage. Because if your choice is between, and I'm talking about, in the middle of 2020, and that sort of environment, between March and August, March and November of 2020, like, I think the choices became really real for people in the industrialized West in ways that it hasn't been really real for a long time, longer than I've been alive. And I'm in my mid-40s. I can't think of any time in my own history in the last 40 years when there's been that much of a crisis point in Western industrialized democracies. And I know I'm leaving out 95% of the rest of the world. I understand that. I have listeners all over the world. I'm not saying any of you didn't have a similar experience. I'm just saying from where we sit, from the continent we're on, it was a game changer in a lot of different ways. And I do think it gave people permission to have courage. And I think that's what they needed. I agree there were some things that were already pushed towards that, but it kind of really lit everybody on fire, right? And I don't know that was a bad thing. I don't know that was a bad thing. All right, well, back to the book, back to the Master and Margarita. We're rounding the corner here. So we're going to end, speaking of the organization that Homeless quit or was maybe shoved out the door of. We're going to talk about the doings at Griboedov's. Am I pronouncing that correctly? I'm probably not. Griboedov's, right?
Griboedov. Griboedov's.
Griboedov's. Can't get it. Can't get that Y sound. Like your mouth has to do an interesting thing with the Y sound, and I can't make my mouth do that. I'm going to try. Griboedov's. Okay. All right. I'm just going to Americanize it. I'm sorry. I'd rather Americanize it than butcher it. Okay. Because I don't want to disrespect anybody. So pardon me. So there were doings at Griboedov's. there were doings at there. And so we're going to read from chapter 5. We're going to read a little bit of a section from chapter 5 as we round the corner here on the Master and Margarita. Masalit had settled itself at Griboedov's in the best and coziest way imaginable. Anyone entering Griboedov's first of all became involuntarily acquainted with the announcements of various sports clubs, and with group as well as individual photographs of the members of Masalit hanging, the photographs, on the walls of the staircase leading to the second floor. On the door to the very first room of this upper floor, one could see a big sign, Fishing and Vacation Section, along with a picture of a carp caught on the line. On the door of room number 2, something not quite comprehensible was written. 1-day creative trips. Apply to M.V. Sprenoznaya. The next door bore a brief but now totally incomprehensible inscription, Perelgino, after which the chance visitor to Griboedov's would not know where to look up from the motley inscriptions on the aunt's walnut doors. Sign up for paper with Polkavingina, cashier, personal accounts of sketch writers. If one cut through the longest line, which started downstairs at the doorman's lodge, one could see the sign housing question on a door which people were crashing every second. Beyond the housing question, there opened out a luxurious poster on which a cliff was depicted, and riding on its crest, a horseman in a felt cloak with a rifle on his shoulder. A little lower, palm trees and a balcony. On the balcony, a seated young man with a forelock, gazing somewhere aloft with very lively eyes, holding a fountain pen in his hand. By the way, pause. I was an art major in college, a Bachelor of Fine Arts major, and we did a lot of study of Soviet realism. And so the image that I have of the posters in my brain is of Soviet realistic art from like the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, where it's all very heroic and looking off to the glorious revolutionary future or whatever. The inscription, full-scale creative vacations from 2 weeks, story novella, to 1 year novel trilogy. Yalta, Suksu, Borovov, Sikhizizri, and I'm going to skip over that one because I can't hit that one. Leningrad Winter Palace. Okay, please forgive me. There was also a line at the door, but not an excessive one, some 150 people. Next, obedient to the whimsical curves, ascents, and descents of the Griboedov house, came the Masalit Executive Board, cashiers numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, editorial board, chairman of Masalit, billiard room, various auxiliary institutions, and finally, that same hall with a colonnade where the aunt had delighted in the comedy of her genius nephew. Any visitor finding himself in Griboedov's, unless, of course, he was a total dimwit, would realize at once what a good life those lucky fellows, the Masalit members, were having. And black envy would immediately start gnawing at him. And he would immediately address bitter reproaches to heaven for not having endowed him at birth with literary talent, lacking which there was naturally no dreaming of owning a Maslowit membership card, brown, smelling of costly leather with a gold wide border, a card known to all Moscow. Who will speak in defense of envy? This feeling belongs to the nasty category, but all the same, one must put oneself in the visitor's position, where what he had seen on the upper floor was not all and was far from all. The entire ground floor of the aunt's house was occupied by a restaurant, and what a restaurant! It was justly considered the best in Moscow. And not only because it took up 2 vast halls with arched ceilings painted with violet Assyrian-maned horses, not only because on each table there stood a lamp shaded with a shawl, not only because it was not accessible to just anybody coming in off the street, but because in the quality of its fare, Griboedov's beat any restaurant in Moscow up and down, and this fare was available at the most reasonable, by no means onerous price. Who will speak in defense of envy? This is something I specifically wanted to ask you about. It's actually not on my notes. This is something I wanted to specifically ask you about. So, I remember as a kid sitting on the floor. I was born in 1979, so I'm old enough to have this memory. I was born at a time when I'm old enough to have this memory. I remember seeing images on television of Russian stores pre the collapse of the Berlin Wall, just empty of any items at all whatsoever. And I remember thinking as a 7-8-year-old kid, man, that sucks. Because like I go to the grocery store all the time and there's like cereal everywhere. And I'm 7. Like I know nothing about market economies. I know nothing about planned economies. I just know anytime I want to go to the store, there's 30,000 different types of cereal that I can get. Fast forward many years, and I've had interactions with people who have gone to grocery stores in other countries, and they have confirmed that we do have a massive number in America, in our grocery stores, of choices, right, that don't exist other places. I know people who have been to India. I know people who have been to Brazil. I know people who have been, I know who had the similar experience in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's not that those places don't know what a grocery store is. Please give me a break. It's just the level of prosperity that shows, right? That demonstrates. Okay. So I'm reading this piece in The Master and Margarita, and I'm trying to transport my brain back to 1920s, 1930s Russia. And I'm trying to think about how an average kulak or peasant from the country would see this. Like, what was the sort of cultural context for this description that Bulkagov gives? And I think he's writing it from that perspective, because when he writes that sentence, who will speak in defense of envy? That's really powerful. And no American writer would ever write that. Like, that's not even other folks who come from other cultures would say that that's because we're all young and innocent and naive here. No, we've been on this continent for 400 years, kids. We're not young and innocent and naive. We just like to come off that way. That's what we like to put forth. We know what the deal is. We know what envy is, but no American writer would ever write that. Or at least not write it so directly, right? What was there to be envious about, Daria? Why would I be envious if I'm an average peasant, like a Chekhov peasant, walking into Maslowitz in the 1930s? Why would I be envious?
Instead of what they have there, I would have my boiled potatoes in my kitchen. Okay, boiled potatoes with some hot dogs. I mean, made of mostly of paper, but this kind of thing, yeah.
Envy like that seeps into the culture, right? So is there still a strain of that now, almost 100 years on, in Russian culture? And I'm not asking you to comment on the whole culture, just obviously what your experiences are, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of envy, and again, it's so natural to me. I mean, yes, there is envy because there were poor people, there are oligarchs, and all those politicians who have lots of money and people who don't have lots of money. But now it's different because you kind of can make your own way up, or at least to some decent level. You can. I mean, obviously you can.
Right.
But back then, you need to be within the certain circles to have access to certain goods. And if you're not there, you've no access. So, I mean, you cannot change the situation drastically unless you have literature talent or any other talent that is needed at the time.
So that's the other piece in here. So Bulgakov is clearly writing about something that he's personally experienced, right? Talk a little bit about what talent did for you, or what talent does for you in that context. Because again, I mean, there are people in my life and people in, things that I like, certain aspects of culture that are talented. The easiest example in America is sports. There are sports athletes that are talented at what they do, for sure. Like, I can't run a 440 like a 22-year-old who's playing for an American football team. Like, I can't, I'm not going to do that, right? And thus, they're not going to pay me, $1 million a year to run a little ball around. Like, nobody's going to do that. I don't have that kind of talent. Okay, that's fine. Even when I was younger, I didn't have that kind of talent. And there's very, very few people I knew who did. That's why there's only, in the American football system, there's only 32 teams. There's only 32. There's not 1,000. There's just 32. Okay. But then you go over to something like literature, right? And almost anybody these days, you talked about self-publishing back in the day, almost anybody these days can publish if you want to. I've self-published 3 books, getting ready to self-publish a 4th. Anybody can publish if you just want it badly enough. And so this idea of literary talent has sort of not waned, but it's become more difficult to be a literary talent. What was the power of that back in the day? Because Bulkagov was still trying to operate right inside of that space. The Master and Margarita, actually as a manuscript, the story of the book itself was very interesting. I believe that, a copy of it got damaged or got burned somehow. And then his widow held on to it, until the 1960s, when she thought under Brezhnev, I think, that she could actually, publish it. And then Brezhnev was like, it's a cool book you got there. Be a shame anything happened to it. And then it sort of went back underground for a long time. And then it sort of popped up again when Perestroika and all that began happening in the mid 80s under Gorbachev. Couldn't think of his name for just a second. Had his face pop up in my brain. But yeah, Gorbachev. And then finally, it sort of started its rise towards more international acclaim. Literary talent, though, I don't know. It's interesting. Like, Russian culture seems to value literary talent in a way that American culture does not. Why is that? Let's start with that. Why is that? Why does Russian culture value writers? Like, they're almost like rock stars, which is insane to me here, because like nobody's looking. I mean, there are a few, like Tom Wolfe back in the day, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, but I can't think of a rock star literary person in the last 20 years in America.
Well, it depends. Like, we didn't have rock stars then.
Okay, all right, maybe. Okay, I shouldn't frame it a rock star. You're right. I'm wrong. Correct me. No, you're right. You're right. I shouldn't.
I mean, we didn't. Okay. So, like, I guess what is that? There should be like some people who are telling something valuable,
right?
I need to make like for this self-publishing books. They're not people. They're not people who write in the books. They're actually taking Bulgakov books, type it on the typing machine, like make it in the form of the book, and give it to their friends to read.
That's still that's publishing. That's,
yeah. I mean, that's not that they were writing something. It's they were. So it's a way of distribution of this banned literature. Yeah.
Okay. All right. By the way, who was on that banned literature list? Who else was on that list other than Bulgakov?
Well, Solzhenitsyn at some point.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I guess there were lots, and they were coming and going because of the policy was changing, so they were kind of coming. So I'm not sure.
Okay. I don't know. It seems as though historically, maybe I'll frame it in a historical context. It seems as though in history, like Tolstoy wasn't broke. Like when he sat down to the train station, was like, I'm just done. He wasn't broke. Like he just decided he was done. And he was going to be Tolstoy. Like he already knew he was going to be Tolstoy, you know. Dostoevsky was a little bit shakier. But again, it's not in general a happy man about much of anything. You just have to read Notes from the Underground for that. But like Chekhov, right? Like Chekhov wrote short stories while he was being while he was serving as a medical doctor, which Bulgakov also served as a medical doctor. So there's this strain in Russian literature that sort of elevates writers in a way that that the American literature or the American culture really, at least not in the last 20 years, the American culture doesn't seem to do.
I mean, I don't know. I can't compare. It kind of feels like natural. Again, starting from Pushkin and Lermontov, they had those, and again, those places, they kind of talked to each other, and they had this community and clubs of writers, composers, artists sharing their view of the world.
Okay. Is that where the idea of the Mazalit came from? Okay. Yeah. Is that where the idea of the Mazalit came from? That concept of like a literary club where you would just go and like hang out?
No. Mazalit it's an institution.
Okay.
That's the Soviet kind of institution. Like you'll have something for writers, you'll have something for artists, you'll have something for engineers. So kind of, or for theaters.
Oh, okay. Got it. I had the thought. So, okay. So
it's kind of, it's an institution like Moscow Society of Literature writers.
Right. Yes. I mean, you would know that because it's I would not that I thought of it as like so the image that I had in my head was like of a private club in New York that's
it's like bureaucracy. It's pure bureaucracy.
Okay.
And all those like rooms that you're reading, it's like the bureaucratic way of like supporting of keeping those writers who write the right thing. And the talent, that literary talent, is not the talent of like good writing. They're bad writers. They're bad poets. I mean, they're bad. But it's not because, and no one sees that they're bad. It's because, I mean, they write the right stuff that suits Soviet regime. And that's why they are in this institution and have access to the benefits, because they support the government, the politics, everything.
So we're doing a video version of this podcast as well as an audio version of the podcast. And on the audio version, you can't hear me, but Daria just saw me, and you'll see it on the video version. Like my mouth just dropped open because like a connection just clicked over in my head. I don't know if Daria heard the click or not. But now there's about 8 other things that make sense in the book that I couldn't figure out. And the biggest thing that I couldn't figure out was why, when Homeless came to Mazalit to tell them about Berlioz getting his head cut off with the tram car, they mobbed him and threw him out. Well, sent him to the mental institution. I couldn't figure that out for the life of me. That was one of the more confusing things. But now that you said the thing about they were propagandists basically for the regime, they couldn't They couldn't tolerate having him in, even if he was telling the truth, because it would interrupt the caviar and the fish. Got it. He was like a Substacker these days in America. He's kind of like a don't want to be invited to the don't. Well, okay, so we have this dynamic in America now where people who run podcasts, people who run Substacks, people who engage in independent journalism, people who are on what is now known as X, formerly Twitter, right? People who are publishing blogs or newsletters, right, that take a particularly oppositional view to whatever the current administration is doing, Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter. Those folks are usually not invited to the party when official channels get together and have conferences and give each other rewards and all this kind of stuff, right? And the thing is, the people doing the things that are independent and are interesting are telling far more truth than whatever comes out of the official channels. So I always say this, no one's watching CNN here in the country. CNN polls maybe 250,000 viewers on a Saturday night. I don't know, sorry, not on a Saturday night, on a regular weeknight. No one watches CNN inside of this country. YouTube cat channels pull more views. And so what are people listening to? Where are people getting their information? Well, they're getting their information from podcasts and, to my point, YouTubers, and to individuals who are not being allowed into those official channels. They're not being allowed into the Mazalit. They could never get in. They could never get in.
Kitchens, big kitchen, big Soviet kitchen.
Big, right. It's a big American kitchen. Podcasting is just a big American kitchen. Writing on Substack is just a big American kitchen. That's yes, exactly. Okay, so that was the click over in my head. Thank you, Daria. You like cleared up a whole part of that book for me that I was confused by, but I was like, I'll figure it out eventually. And so you helped me, help me figure that out. Thank you. Okay. One of the things that we pick up from Master and Margarita, right? And Daria, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. This was great. I loved having a conversation with you, talking with you about this great book. We may indeed revisit this book because there's other things in it. We only covered like book 1 of the Master and Margarita. There's a whole book 2. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that happens in there. And that's where the aforementioned Margarita shows up. And really, well, she's twirled around the room and does what she needs to do. Oh, and there's some resolution to Woland as well in there, which I'm not gonna tell you all what that is, but you need to go get the book. But I wanna sort of set up this thing here. So one of the things we're trying to do on this podcast this year is we're trying to talk more about solutions to problems than problems themselves. And we've talked a little bit today about lying, and we've talked a little bit about myths and deceptions. Talked a little bit about moral character and courage, and what does it mean to actually engage with courage inside of an organization. We talked about the political consequences a little bit of engaging with moral clarity, things like job loss or loss of promotion or demotion, right? Or even having to give up your job and go do something someplace else, right? One of the things that gets folks who are in a postmodern, who are steeped in a postmodern mindset, one of the things that makes them feel really icky sometimes is this idea that there could be such a thing as moral clarity. Like there is right and there is wrong, and there are a difference between the two of those things. And the reason it gets the postmodern mind feeling icky is because it implies that perhaps there is something outside of how I feel about a thing. There might be something else that's outside of that, and that might be the higher thing. There's a lot of confusion about moral clarity. And so if the dominant culture, this is the question I have for you. If the dominant culture that you're in an organization is driven by lies, how can leaders get moral clarity? How can they get that? What's the way forward for them? Because I think you have to get clarity before you can take courageous action. And there's a model that we use with our clients called the 3 C's model, right? And the first C is clarity. Because if you're not clear, then a whole lot of other things just don't happen, right? But then you have to be candid, which means you have to be able to actually say what the truth is and actually know it clearly in your brain. And then there's courage, right? And then that's where you act, you implement, right? And those 3 C's have to go together. It's a triangle or a virtuous circle, right? Okay. How can leaders get moral clarity in a culture where that may not be the thing that's valued?
It's not even valued, it's like banned.
Or we'll go, I like that one too. If it's banned, if moral clarity is banned, how can leaders get moral clarity?
I mean, my immediate response would be, you need to be born like that. Because what is the question? It's obvious, it's clear, you can see it. Like Margarita sees that, Master sees that. But when we look at the Ivan homeless and see the transformation from this voice of propaganda to this moral clarity, like candid and courage. So he went through this catharsis, through the absurd of what's happening with him and out, like around him. Had, again, I guess the first that they had is the courage. So it's kind of a question, is that right? What is truth? And it's probably, I even say the courage comes first, because you need courage to look to seek for truth. Because it's very convenient to go to Peridelkina every summer and have this fish, and it's nice. But once you start asking uncomfortable questions, you might get sent to, you might be called a lunatic and sent to,
you might wind up on a beach. You might wind up on a beach in Yalta.
Yeah.
That happens to one of the characters in there. Because not only does he not have moral clarity, he's hungover and confused. Yeah. Which, by the way, that also runs through, just as a pointer for everybody, the consumption of vodka runs through the Master and Margarita. Even Pontius Pilate, when he's questioning Yeshua, is doing so from a one down position because his head is split with a hangover. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
It's not a hangover. It's like he's sick.
Yeah, I got the impression that it was a hangover.
No. Okay. The thing is that he's sick and he has like this rapid headaches, very severe headaches. And Yeshua was the only person who could see, who could calm it down.
Calm it down, right? Yeah, okay.
And he sends them to death, knowing that he will keep those terrible headaches, and he will have to live with those terrible headaches after that.
Another clip just went over in my head. Another clip just went over my head. Go ahead.
Yeah, and unlike this, like the Pilate from the Bible, he sees the truth. He knows what the truth is. He knows that Yeshua is innocent. He knows that Yeshua is the only like source of his like being calm and his comfort. But he has no power. He great. Pilate, he has no power, and he sends him, and he has no courage.
Right. Okay, so great follow-up question. If you have power but no courage, what do you do? If you're a leader with power but no courage, and by the way, there are a lot of those leaders in the world today.
Well, he has no power, real power, because he's ruled by the Caesar, by the city. He's a bureaucrat, yes. He has no power. So
But
he's not the.
he thinks he does. He even tells Yeshua he does.
He thinks he does.
He thinks he does, right? And again, we have a lot of that in our world today.
Yes.
Like, it's easy on this podcast. We always pick on the World Economic Forum. We always pick on those people who meet in Davos and eat expensive chicken and ride around in Switzerland and pick up chocolate and then tell us what they think is going to happen in the next year, right? And invariably, they're easy to pick on because, number one, it looks like they all stepped out of central casting for a James Bond movie. Like, it's like they're all James Bond villains. You go watch a James Bond villain and it's Klaus Schwab. Like, I've said this before on the podcast. It's probably going to get me canceled. It's fine. It's the truth. Everybody can see it. But that's number one. And they think that they have a lot of power. Bill Gates thinks he has a lot of power about what you and I eat. He thinks he does. And yet, and I'm not asking you to comment on Bill Gates, and yet, when I go to the grocery store, the Bill Gates sponsored meat is the only meat on the aisle that doesn't get bought. Nobody's touching that. Nobody. You saw this. I saw this during COVID. Literally, you walk in and the meat brought to you by the former head of Microsoft is just sitting there. It's just sitting there on the shelf. And every other piece of meat that came from a cow is gone. And if it's choice between Bill Gates' meat or eating nothing or eating vegetables, people are going to go eat the vegetables. And yet and still, he keeps getting invited to the World Economic Forum and telling me that how things are going to be. There's a disconnect here. It's the same disconnect between Pontius Pilate and Jesus. Leaders who have power, or at least think they do, but don't have moral clarity. They're not listening to the podcast. It's okay. We could be truthful. They're not listening to me. So what do they do? We could be truthful here. What do they do? We're having a kitchen conversation. Hey, what do they do?
And they don't do nothing because they don't have the clarity. They don't have courage. I mean, if you don't see that you need to change, you want change. And
Right.
it's just stupid to try and change someone who doesn't want to be changed.
Right.
Who finds comfort in. The thing is, change what you can change. You can change your own team. If you're a leader of a team, you can change your own organization. If you're a leader of an organization, you can change your community. If you're the leader of a community, there are lots of things you can change. So just don't waste your time on those who don't want.
One of the questions I always ask at the end of the podcast is this one. And I ask it of every guest who comes on. How can leaders use the Master and Margarita to stay on the path of leadership? How can they use the insights from this book to stay on the path of leadership, Daria?
Leadership, and being a decent human being,
mm-hmm.
which is, leaders are an example of decent behavior, what's right and what's wrong. So I guess, as I said in the beginning, is seeing the variety of leadership possibilities. You don't have to be in power to be a leader. You don't have to have your own vision to be a leader. There are lots of different ways to lead. And making choices, making everyday choices, small choices, helping people around you, saving who you can save and who want to be saved, and not wasting your time and energy on those who don't.
I agree with all of that. And I would add, it is critically important, I think, in our time, not only in an American context, but in a global context. I particularly think it's critical right now in our particular global moment to, as a leader, have the clarity to understand the difference between what's a myth and what's the truth, and have the courage to point out that the emperor has no clothes. because I fundamentally believe that we are turning a corner on chaos, and we're turning a corner on confusion, and we're turning a corner on despair. The winter is almost over. And the people, the leaders who led during winter, if they cannot change to lead in the spring, will be left by the side of the road. We don't need more of an explanation of the chaos. We need more of an explanation of the difference between the myth and the truth, and then leading people invariably towards the truth and all of the outcomes that come from that. To Daria's point, does not have to be large things. I'm not asking you to start a podcast or do a Substack. I'm not asking you to self-publish a book or even type up somebody else's published book and pass it around, although I think that's a really good idea. I'm not asking you to go face down Stalin or Pontius Pilate or Bill Gates or Klaus Schwab or whoever. I'm not asking you to do any of that. All of this starts wherever you are at, whether you're in Madurai, India, or Moscow, Russia, or Lagos, Nigeria. All of this starts, as it always does, everywhere, in your own home, in your own backyard, with your own neighbors. Start telling them the truth first. Start separating myths from truth in your own household first. Trust me, that'll give you plenty to do for the next few years. Just start there. Cut your eye teeth there. And then you'll have enough of a skin, enough of a shell to be able to handle whatever snares or arrows may come about when you go into your larger community, when you go to your work, and even, again, starting locally, when you go to your local government official, your local bureaucracy. You'll be ready to speak the truth to them. And that's how the changes that we want to see get made are going to happen as we enter into the next spring high. I'm looking forward to it. I'm doing my part. I want to thank Daria Rudnik for coming on our podcast and for having a conversation with us. This was great. Love talking about Master and Margarita. And you can find her on all of the different places. So Daria, what are all the different places that we can find you? How do we get a hold of you? Where are you located at? Because we'll have all the links to everything that she's about to tell us in the show notes. But Daria, how can we get a hold of you if we want to talk with you more?
Okay. First of all, thanks, Jason. I mean, it was fun talking about that. It was like talking in the kitchen. I haven't done it for a while. So yeah, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I mean, it's the easiest way is to find me on LinkedIn.
All right. So we will have access to all of the different places on LinkedIn that you can get a hold of.
Yes, it's all there. Yeah, my website is there.
Yeah, we'll have our website links in the show notes below the podcast player. We'll have our LinkedIn profile link in the show notes below the player, wherever you listen to this podcast. Once again, thank you very much for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. And with that, we're out. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show. As it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.